Welcome back. Today I'm going to talk about how to evaluate a chess position during a game. Sometimes a position you find out later after the game that I was way behind here. I had no idea. Now the position shown on the board, one player has a huge advantage and the other player is at a huge disadvantage right now, but it wasn't obvious to me when I saw this position during the game. Even in the evaluation, I was surprised when I saw which player had the advantage at this point. A few months ago, when I listed a bunch of my weaknesses, things that I needed to work on, this was one of the ones I listed. Now, I should mention a disclaimer to anyone who's not familiar with my channel. I'm not a chess coach. I'm not a titled player. I'm just sharing what I've picked up and what's helping me, and hopefully that will help you as well. And then let me say, I researched on quite a few different websites using various search engines to come up with how do I evaluate a chess position during a game, or even afterward if you want to analyze your own games without an engine. And there were lots of pieces of advice, lots of lists, and the items that I saw on almost all of those lists and listed with the highest priority were the following. The first was material, then king safety, development or active pieces, space, and pawn structure. And I'm going to go over each of those in turn. This is the first one, I think, because it's the easiest one to understand. It's one of the very first things that we teach beginners. We teach them about the value of the pieces. Like the queens are valued at 9 points apiece, or the rooks are valued at 5 points apiece. And of course, the bishops and the knights valued at 3 points apiece. Pawns valued at 1 point apiece. So if one player is missing a pawn, that player is a point down in material. We all understand that it's very simple. One thing that's more difficult for beginners to understand, and it took me a while anyway to learn, was that those point values are relative. For example, later in the game, when one of these pawns gets near the end of the board and is about to promote into a queen, down here that pawn is more valuable than it was back here on the second rank where it started. The rooks become more valuable often later in the game. They don't mean anything right now. They can't move. Really, they can't do anything. And a lot of times, if we develop most of our pieces, but not all of them, we see positions in games where the knight is still there blocking in that rook. Well, that rook's basically valued at 0 at that point. It has potential value, but it's not really valued until it's active and out. So that's something to keep in mind, that pieces have a relative value, depending on the phase of the game, where they're positioned on the board. Like, for example, if you've heard knights on the rim or dim, I think there's another rhyme for that as well. Knights on the edge of the board can control fewer spaces than knights in the middle of the board, where they can hit a lot more spaces and control a lot more of the board. Here, this knight can go to 8 different spots, but a knight on the edge can only go to 4 different spots. And of course, if the knight were in the corner, it can only go to 2 spots. So not as powerful there. Okay, so material, I think, is the easiest one to understand. The second one is king safety. This one should be number 1 in priority wise. It's just a little less easy to understand for a beginner. Because if your king isn't safe and if the opponent can attack it, then most of the rest of the stuff matters a lot less. For example, we've all, or most of us, I assume, have learned Scholar's Mate at some point in our chess development. And if the opponent doesn't watch out for it, their king is in a very unsafe position here, because both our bishop and our queen are pointing at f7, and we have checkmate on the next move if they make another non-helpful move. So king safety trumps everything else at this point. It overrides the amount of material, pawn structure, active development, and so forth. Now here white obviously has more active development and active pieces, but king safety is the issue here. And there are going to be times later in the game where king safety is an issue as well, even if material is equal and pawn structure is symmetrical and so forth and so on, but one player has moved pawns in front of their king and the other player hasn't. The king safety will be the difference often in the evaluation. The next thing on our list was development and active pieces. We kind of talked about that in the position that we just looked at. One player has pieces that are developed and out and doing things. And now if the other player develops a piece to block our checkmate, and we also develop a piece and we're prepared to castle, they can continue just pushing pawns. And we castle, well, On this board, it didn't automatically castle for us. But now we've developed this piece too. We have 4 active pieces. And with a pawn move, we're going to be able to activate this bishop, and we'll soon have our knight out. And as I discussed in the introduction or earlier on, these pieces don't do anything back here. The knight's the only one that can even get out without moving pawns. This bishop can't go anywhere. This rook can't go anywhere. So they're useless. And the same is going to be true for pieces over here on the other side. So active piece development. The pieces that are out and about can do more. So I think that makes sense as well. And I think that also makes a little bit more of a difference in the opening. That's one reason we teach as part of opening principles, and I'm learning as part of opening principles, is besides controlling the center and getting our king to safety, developing pieces to good squares is one of the opening principles. And the reason for that is because you have better chances with pieces out there doing things, or able to do things, I should say. Space, this one is a little more nuanced, I guess, because it's not just how much space on the board you occupy. For example, if we make big pawn moves and our opponent makes small pawn moves, we have more space. And part of the space is the space that we're occupying on the board, but also it's space that we're controlling. And these pawns control squares on the other side of that middle line. And so I'm learning about this means we have more space, whereas the opponent doesn't control any squares on our side of the board, and we control squares on their side of the board. This is often why opening principles are occupying and controlling the center, because now these two players occupy or control equal amount of space around and near the center and on the other side of the board. So in the position that we opened this video with, in this position, White has more space. And part of that is because of these pawns that have advanced and they're controlling squares way over here on our side of the board. We have one piece that's across the center line, and it's only controlling 2 squares on that side of the board. This rook controls a little bit of space, but our queen is effectively cut off by our own pawns, so it doesn't control a lot of space, whereas the opponent's queen is controlling space on our side of the board all the way. Lots of diagonals and files that queen can control, and these coming down. Now, in this case, this is the position that I opened with. I was surprised that when I ran the evaluation that I was way ahead in this position, playing with the black pieces. And using those principles that we just looked at on my list, which I will show again. We haven't yet covered the last one, but here I am up in material by 1 pawn. So I'm this pawn ahead. We both have 2 rooks. We both have a queen. So why is black so far ahead? The only thing I could come up with was king safety. Black king is relatively safe here compared to the white king, who has pushed his own pawns way too far forward to offer any protection. The other thing I could think of, possibly, was that this rook battery really isn't going anywhere. And that speaks to the last thing on the list, which was pawn structure. The opponent has a gap over here on the B file. So, and they're not controlling that gap. I have a gap on the queen side as well, but I am controlling that gap. And they have this open, semi-open file here on the E file, and they have a battery lined up there, but the battery isn't going anywhere because of my pawn structure. And there are probably better examples. I just wanted to use the same position since I had it there anyway. But pawn structure makes a difference, especially if we start trading off these heavy pieces and get into an endgame. But at some point that happens. As we transition from the middle game into the end game, the queens attack each other at some point and end up being traded. The rooks end up being traded, and we end up with only pawns on the board. And often then the pawn structure will make a huge difference, even if everything else is equal. Okay, and this is a position I just threw out on the board editor on Lichess and then guessed at what the evaluation might be, checked Stockfish, and I was right, using the ideas that we've just learned. And the way that I evaluated this is with pawn structure and king safety and piece activity. And because the material is exactly equal, both sides have exactly 6 pawns, both sides have a knight, both sides have a rook, but white has a much better pawn structure. These pawns all the way up, except for this last one, are all protected by the pawn behind them. We have a rook behind this pawn. We have limited possibilities for the opponent's pieces. For example, this knight can't move here because it would run into our pawn. This knight can't move here because it would run into our pawn. This knight can't move here because it would run into our pawn. Whereas our pieces have more chances of being of getting into the game and activating and doing something. It depends on whose turn it is, what the evaluation is. But these pawns are not able to defend each other because they're in front of each other. The same is going to be true with this one. Also, in endgames, you want your king closer to the center of the board, and that's the case here. So just by using the things that I've just learned, I learned here that the pawn structure makes a huge difference, and the activity or possible activity of the pieces made a huge difference. Now I want to talk about some points that weren't listed on that first list. Okay. These are some points that I found on those same websites, but I didn't find these on quite as many lists or with as great a frequency or listed with quite as high of a priority. But they are things that affect how we evaluate positions. And they are files and diagonals. Who controls open files? Who has pieces controlling long diagonals like bishops or queens? Who occupies or controls the center? Because most pieces are more powerful in the center. As we saw in a previous example, the knight controls more squares from the center, the queen controls more squares from the center, and so forth, than they do in corners. The initiative, in other words, who is forcing each move, who is making things happen, who keeps offering threats and developing, forcing the other player to react. Whose turn is it? Wait, did I skip one? Yeah, I'll get back to that. Whose turn is it? That makes a difference. If you plug the last position that I showed on the board into Stockfish, and say it's white's turn, you'll get one evaluation. But if you replug that position in and say it was black's turn, then you'll get a different evaluation, because sometimes that makes a huge difference. There have been a very few cases that I've seen where both players had a mate in one if it was their turn. My son ran into that in a rapid game just a couple of months ago. I think I got it on video when I was watching him play a rapid game. His opponent missed mate in one, but it was still there hanging, and then my son had a mate in one. So it depended on whose turn it was, who won. Weaknesses. Weaknesses can be all kinds of things, and I still don't understand all of them, but I'm trying to learn. Weakness could be a piece that's undefended, like on the position that I just showed on the board, on the screen, I mean. My knight's undefended. My rook's undefended. Those are potential weaknesses if an opponent were able to do something about it. As we already mentioned, the base of the pawn chain, they're undefended right now. They can be defended with careful play. For example, if I were to move this pawn forward and put the rook behind it, then that front pawn would be defended and the back pawn would be defended by the rook. Or the king might move over to defend that pawn. The king could defend both of these at the same time. This pawn could be defended by moving forward, but then the back one, the one that's now left in the back, is undefended. And even though nothing is attacking that piece, once we move this pawn forward, let's say it was our turn, now this piece is undefended. And if the opponent had a piece that could come for it, or if they can maneuver a piece into a place where they can get to that pawn, then that's a weakness. And weaknesses can be all kinds of things, like an exposed king. It can be doubled pawns. Like here, our opponent has 2 sets of doubled pawns. And it might even be worse if, for example, this set of doubled pawns were over here where they're isolated and can't be protected by any of the other pawn islands. Pawn islands can be a weakness instead of having all the pawns in a row that can protect each other. But most of us, I think, at my level, we can probably simplify and just think of weaknesses as undefended pieces. Sometimes the undefended piece is defended, but then you can remove the defender. So that's a type of undefended piece. Those are the kinds of things I'm thinking of as weaknesses. I know I have some higher rated or stronger players that watch some of my videos. If you can list some other types of weaknesses, feel free to let me know. On a minor piece imbalance was the last one there that I came across that I thought was worth listing here. And of course, that I think refers to the fact that even though both types of minor pieces, knights and bishops, are rated usually at 3 points, is what their valuation is, they're different kinds of pieces. They can do different kinds of things. And that's an imbalance. Even if we rate them both as 3 points, or value them both at 3 points, the bishop can control a lot more space, for one thing, especially if it's placed on or near the center. Assuming nothing's in its way, bishops can go a long ways and get from one end of the board to the other very quickly, whereas knights can't. If this knight was in the corner, think of how long it would take that knight to get to the other edge of the board. Even if nothing's in its way, right? 1, 2, 3, 4 moves, and it's still not quite to the corner. Whereas the bishop, if it were in the corner and nothing was in its way, can get all the way to the other side in one move. So it makes a difference, especially depending on what type of endgame you have. And if there are a lot of pawns that are locked up against each other, for example, if we have pawns that are locked like this in the middle, the knight is usually better at getting around those. And I'm just shuffling some pieces around here to show kind of what I mean. For example, here in this position, our bishop's not going to be able to get through. It just isn't. Even if we shuffle some pieces around and try to get through here, it's going to be hard because the opponent has 2 pawns guarding that square. And yes, we could move our bishop here to point at it. We could maybe shift our king around to the other side. But by then, they're going to have a rook pointed at that square as well, or they're going to have moved their knight over, pointing at that square. And our bishop's not going to be able to get through. But their knight, it can get through. It can get right there safely, protected by both pawns, and then it can just go ahead and hop into our position. So depending on what the pawn structure is and where the other pieces are and what else is going on, the minor piece imbalance can be a huge deal because they can do different things in different positions. Now, if all these pawns are off the board, the bishop is probably, in most cases, a much stronger piece. But with all these pawns on the board, the knight is the stronger piece. Again, in this example, because it can hop right there and get into our side easily, whereas the bishop just can't. One other downside of the bishop you might have noticed is that this bishop can only see half the squares on the board. It's a dark squared bishop, so it can only go to dark squares. The knight can go to any square on the board. Now, it's going to take some time to get there, but it can go to light squares and dark squares and light squares and dark squares. And so that makes a difference if it comes down to a pawn promotion, for example. If we have a dark squared bishop, but our opponent is going to promote this pawn, for example, this one wasn't here, this pawn is going to march down and its promotion square is on a light square. Our dark squared bishop can't defend that square. We're going to have to stop the pawn before it gets to the end, especially if rooks are off the board. So that makes a difference. Whereas the knight could get into a position to guard that square. The bishop can't. Our dark squared bishop cannot possibly guard a light square. So anyway, that's what the minor piece imbalance refers to. There are other imbalances, which I admit I don't fully understand yet. The first list that I looked at was these are the 5 items that I saw on most sites where actual chess coaches or titled players or experts were talking about the ways to evaluate your position during the game. Material, that's the easiest one for beginners to learn. King safety. Is your king safe? Is it about to be checkmated? Can it escape if someone checks it? Development and active pieces. Do you still have rooks trapped in the corners? Are your pieces out in front of the pawns looking at active squares, controlling center things? Space. How much space on the opponent's side of the board do you occupy? And which player occupies more space or controls more space? As you look at more and more positions, at least I'm starting to see places where the space matters. Now, in the example position that I showed earlier in this video, one player had more space, but they weren't ahead. And I think the reason they weren't ahead was because of piece activity and king safety. So each of these can cancel each other out. And pawn structure. We talked about doubled pawns. We talked about locked pawns, pawn islands, things like that. And that's another weak point that I'm still working on. But I do know that that's one way to evaluate a position. And of course, the minor points, again, just to review, who controls open files or diagonals, who's occupying or controlling the center, who has the initiative, what are each player's relative weaknesses, whose turn is it, and minor piece imbalances. Now, I'm going to show a couple of positions from my own real games in which I misevaluated during the game, and I'm going to try to use this new information to guess what the actual evaluation is. Okay, here's another position in which I was playing with the black pieces. Let's see, let's start with material. Here we are equal on material. Both players have 2 rooks and a queen. Both players have 1 knight, so no bishops and no other knight. It looks like the pawns are equal as well. I have 7 pawns. My opponent has 7 pawns. Okay, so that part's all the same. What about king safety? That was the third one, was it not? Let's look at our list. Okay, well, we did material, and so let's see. King safety is the next one. All right. My king is safer than the opponent's king. My opponent has neglected to castle. Their king is still in the middle of the board. And if they choose to castle kingside, they've already pushed pawns in front of that area. And they've already got a gap on their queen side. So if they choose to castle that way, there's a gap there. So it looks like, and it doesn't look like, I think it's fairly simple. Black has better king safety here. So material is even, but king safety is a plus for black. I don't know how much of a plus, but I know that's a plus. What was the next thing on the list? Development and active pieces. It looks like we're about even on that. Both of us have a knight out in front of our pawn chain, and both of us have a queen off the back rank, but behind a pawn. Both queens control some fairly long diagonals here. This one's a little shorter, but both queens are controlling some amount of space, and about the same. Both knights hit a couple of spots on the opponent's side of the board. So that part's about equal. One difference on development and active pieces is that I have castled so that my rooks see each other and they're both can be active. Neither rook is trapped. Whereas my opponent, their rooks do not see each other because they haven't castled, and therefore neither rook can go very far here. This rook could go to the semi-open file. This rook really can't do anything until it's castled. So that's another plus for black. What was the next one? Space. I think white has a little bit more space here because I only have 1 pawn. These 2 pawns kind of cancel each other out when it comes to space. They have another pawn controlling space on my side of the board. We already talked about the knights both have about the same amount of control on the opponent's side of the board, as well as the queen. Their queen hits 1 square on my side over here and 2 squares on my side over here, whereas my queen doesn't hit any on their side here, but 1, 2, 3 squares on that side. So the space is about even here, and pawn structure was the other thing. Who has the better pawn structure here? Black does. Not only have I not pushed any pawns in front of my king, but I have a little pawn chain developing right here, or already developed, and there's another pawn here that's connected to that. This is my only pawn island over here on the A file. My opponent has 3 pawn islands. They have these 2 on the A and B, then they have this doubled pawns here on the D file that are isolated from the other pawns, can't be protected by other pawns. And then they have these 3 over here that can work together. So if we look at the list, our material is equal and our space was about equal, but with king safety, black is ahead. Development was also about equal. So except for the rooks, black had a slight edge with the rooks, black has an edge with king safety, and black has an edge with pawn structure. So this position should have an advantage for black. If we only consider those 5. Let me turn on the engine and get that out of the way. Okay, the engine here is showing that black has a minus, looks like about 2. Well, let me click that there and see if it can run just a little bit further. Minus 2.3. Yeah, minus 2.1 to minus 2.5, somewhere in that range. So black does have an advantage, and I have to assume it's because of the things that I said. That's the whole point of this exercise, is learning how to evaluate these things. So we saw here material was even, space was even. Black had slightly better development with the rooks already being out. Black had significantly better king safety and a better pawn structure. So black has the advantage of minus 2.1. Let's look at one more position. Equal on material. Both sides have 2 rooks. Both sides have 2 knights. Both sides have a bishop. Both sides have a queen. And it looks like the pawns are even as well. Both sides missing a c-pawn. So material is even. King safety. White has the advantage here. White has castled, and all the pawns are in place in front of the king. Black has not castled, has already moved 1 rook, so we can't castle that way. They could castle on the king side, but those pawns have already been pushed. So white's up with king safety. Next was space. That's a little debatable. It looks like white has slightly more space. We have a knight that is controlling 1, 2, 3 squares on the other side of the board, not to mention occupying a square on the other side of the board. We have pawns hitting several spaces on the other side of the board. But so does our opponent. Our opponent has control of some spaces on our side with their pawns. Our bishop hits there. Our knight hits those 2. Their queen has a little bit of control on these squares, so the space may be about even, but I'm going to say white has slightly more space here due to this advanced pawn and this knight outpost. What were the other things? Development, active pieces. Here we have this rook that hasn't castled, so the 2 rooks don't see each other. But black does have a piece on an open file, a rook controlling an open file, so I suppose that is in its favor. But this bishop isn't going anywhere. It's pointing at the back of its own pawn, whereas our bishop is seeing quite a bit further than theirs. So I'm going to say, because our rooks see each other and because our bishop is pointing at more places, I'm going to say we have slightly more active, better developed pieces. This knight is also not doing great because that pawn is defended and this square is defended, as is that one. That knight really doesn't have a lot of places it can go. Okay, so white has a slight edge there. And was the last one pawn structure? Our pawn structures are almost identical here because, again, each of us have just lost our c-pawns. Our pawns are slightly more advanced than theirs in the middle, and these pawns are still secure around our king. So I'm going to say maybe white has a slight advantage in pawn structure, but probably so slight as to not make a difference. So I'm going to say it comes down to king safety and the development, but also something that was listed on the second list that wasn't listed on this main list was whose turn is it matters here, and it's white's turn. So that gives a plus to white as well because black has a weakness over here, an undefended piece, and it's our turn. So if we look at the turn on the engine here, all right, you can see the evaluation bar on the left. White has a plus 4.7 advantage in this situation. There might be something else that I'm missing, but we came down to material is equal, space is a little bit in white's favor, king safety is definitely in white's favor, and the whose turn it is and weaknesses turned out to make a lot of difference here because it is white's turn. And black has a very obvious weakness there in the corner that white can attack now. And Stockfish does say that's the best move, and you'll be happy to know that that is what I played in this position. I didn't know that I was up plus 4, but if I had taken some time to look at it and with this new knowledge evaluate this position, I think I would have guessed maybe plus 2 here in this position, maybe 2 or 3, somewhere in that range. but I'm going to get better at it because I'm going to be practicing this, not only during games, but while I evaluate games without the engine. Okay, do we want to do one more position? We've gone on long enough. Why not? Let's check one more. Okay, here is a game where I was playing with the black pieces. Let's see what we can look at. At this point, each player has lost a knight at this point, but everything else is equal. Both players have all 8 pawns. Both players have 1 knight. Both players have 2 bishops and all their other pieces. It's fairly early in the game. But again, there are differences. One difference I've noticed, the white has 2 pieces developed and in our face. This knight is controlling squares on our side of the board. The bishop is controlling squares on our side of the board. Their pawn is controlling squares on our side of the board. So it looks like white has taken more space here and has more development. King safety is identical. Both kings are here on their original squares with a bishop and a queen on either side and 2 pawns in the middle. So I think king safety is equal. Our little pawn over here is one imbalance as well. The fact that our pawn structure has been messed up. It looks like there was a trade here and we ended up having to take. That must have been how the 2 knights got off the board. They took our knight and we took it. So our pawn structure is askew, so to speak. Now, what else? Let's look at the list again. Okay, material is equal, king safety is equal. Development, white has a lead. And space, white has a lead. Pawn structure, white has a lead. So I would evaluate this as being, based on those 5 things, I would evaluate this as being slightly ahead for white. Now, I'm trying to think what were the things on the other list. Where is our other list? Okay, files and diagonals. Well, black has control of a couple of diagonals. But, white has control of a fairly long diagonal as well. The center, looks like white has slightly better control over the center, but it's kind of hard for me to tell. Initiative. Also hard to tell. Whose turn is it? It's black's turn. So that might make a difference. That's the only point we found in favor of black so far. Weaknesses. I want to say that black has some weaknesses here. That white has weaknesses here. The black's weakness is the fact that this pawn got off its file and it's out there by itself, I think. But white's weakness is that they have a piece that can be immediately attacked by a fairly normal move, h6. And then, then that piece has to drop back. And then black can immediately attack the knight with the next pawn move. Which is, if they were not smart enough and only moved the bishop there, then that second pawn move of ours would attack both those pieces. But either way, okay, so black, I think, has the initiative here. That's going to be black's next move, if it were me playing. Oh, and it was me playing. And then wherever that bishop goes, even if it goes all the way back, our next move can be g5, attacking the knight. Oh, and the knight doesn't have anywhere to go. Okay, so even though this is the one where the second, I didn't get the picture out of the way. Oh my, well that's embarrassing. Hopefully you can understand what I was talking about here. It's black's turn, so black has h6, the bishop has to go. Then black has g5, and the knight doesn't have anywhere to go because its only square it can possibly move to is guarded by this, our pawn that I said was out of place. So that secondary list came in important here because if I just went by the first 5 points, I thought white was winning. But when I added on those other points, it made a difference. That I'm going to guess black has a lead here somewhere between 1 and 3. It surely can't be as high as 5. Okay, let's look at the engine. All right, Stockfish is showing that black's advantage is minus 2.2 or 2.3. And it is indeed suggesting h6 as our next move. And then the bishop will go back to here. Not sure why they're blocking their own pawn. I think I would go back a little further with it. But then the move after that is going to be g5 because the knight is trapped. If the knight at that point tried to come in here, we have another pawn that can win it. If the knight came here, we have a bishop that can win it. And if the knight goes there, our pawn, of course, can take it. Okay, so hopefully this was helpful. It's helped me just to work my way through it. And yes, I know this video is long, but this is a process that's taken me months so far. And it, of course, took hours for me to search these sites and make these lists. And then every time I evaluate a position during a game, I'm trying to remember all these things. And hopefully it will help you to be able to do that as well. Again, those of you who know more than I do, if I missed something or if I misstated something, please feel free to let me know or correct me in the comments. I know that I'm learning this. I know that I'm not an expert, so it won't hurt my feelings. And it'll help me get better. Thank you for watching, and as always, we'll see you next time.